Hello everyone, I am Dark Files, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back and relax. Let's begin. It started with an inheritance, a house deep in the woods, left to me by an uncle. I barely remembered. The letter from the lawyer explained that I was his only living relative. And as such, the estate was now mine. I had only been to the house once before. When I was a child, my memories of that day were foggy. Just fleeting images of dark wood floors, the musty smell of old books, and the unsettling feeling that I was being watched, even when my uncle and I were the only ones in the room. The house stood at the edge of a dying town, surrounded by towering pines, and a mist that clung to the earth like a living thing. It was a relic from another time, with ivy crawling up its stone walls, and a front door that groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a thick, suffocating stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The air was stale, undisturbed for years. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing against the high ceilings. The furniture was covered in dust sheets, ghostly shapes of chairs and tables frozen in time. The fireplace, though cold, smelled faintly of smoke, as if someone had been there not long ago. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, around midnight, I heard my name. It wasn't loud, just a whisper carried through the air like a drifting scent. I turned toward the sound, my breath caught in my throat. It came from upstairs. I hadn't been up there yet. My heart pounded as I climbed the grand staircase, each step creaking beneath my weight. The hallway was lined with closed doors, their brass knobs dulled with age. The voice came again, soft, distant, calling my name. I swallowed hard and reached for the nearest doorknob. The door swung open with a whisper, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. A massive canopy bed stood in the center, its velvet drapes untouched by dust. A large, gilded mirror hung on the opposite wall, its surface dark and rippling like water. I stepped inside, drawn toward the mirror. My reflection wavered, distorted. I reached out to touch it. A hand, pale and skeletal, reached back from the other side. I stumbled away with a choked gasp. The mirror rippled like a pond, and for a brief moment, I saw something staring at me. A gaunt, hollow-eyed figure that looked almost like me. But wrong. The whispering grew louder. The walls pulsed, shadows stretched. The house was awake, and it had been waiting for me. The moment passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I turned and fled down the hall, but as I reached the top of the stairs, I felt the air shift behind me. A low creak, a breath of cold. I forced myself to look back. The bedroom door stood wide open, but the room was empty. The mirror, however, now faced the hallway, though I was certain it had been bolted to the wall. That night, I locked myself in the master bedroom downstairs, the only room that didn't feel quite as suffocating. I lay awake, listening. The rain outside had started to fall in a slow, rhythmic patter, and in the distance, something tapped against the window. Tap, tap, tap. I refused to look. I pulled the covers over my head, heart hammering. The tapping stopped. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Not from the house settling, not from my imagination. Something was inside the room with me. I could hear the slow, deliberate steps circling the bed. I held my breath, gripping the sheets so tightly. My knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped at the side of the bed. A whisper inches from my ear. "You came back." I bolted upright, turning on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. My breath came in ragged gasp, my body trembling. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went into town desperate for answers. The locals were hesitant to speak to me. Their faces turned grim the moment I mentioned the house. Finally, an old man at the cafe took pity on me. He motioned for me to sit, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "That house," he said in a hushed voice, "has been abandoned for decades. Your uncle was the last to live there, and he left in the middle of the night, never came back." I swallowed. "Why?" "They say something lives in that house. Not a ghost, not exactly, It's something worse. A chill ran down my spine. I heard something last night. I admitted. It spoke to me. The old man's face paled. He leaned in closer. Then you need to leave. Now, I wanted to heed his warning, but curiosity kept me tethered. I returned to the house that evening, determined to find out the truth. The rain had started again, heavier this time. The house loomed in the distance, its windows like dark, watching eyes. I stepped inside and was immediately met with an unnatural stillness. The mirror in the upstairs bedroom was gone. In its place, deep scratches marred the walls, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Then I heard the whisper again, closer this time. I've been waiting. The door slammed shut behind me. The house had me now, and it wasn't going to let me go. It started as a wrong turn. I had been driving through the back roads of Louisiana, trying to find a shortcut back to the highway. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and the deeper I went, the more unfamiliar the landscape became. The road narrowed, swallowed by dense forest on both sides. Spanish moss draped from the trees like tattered curtains, and the sound of my tires against the gravel was the only thing breaking the silence. Then I saw the first sign, a rusted metal signpost, bent at an odd angle, standing at the side of the road. It had no writing, just deep jagged scratches that might have once been letters, but had been long since worn away. A shiver crawled up my spine. I kept driving. The road stretched on endlessly, winding deeper into the forest. My fuel gauge dipped lower, my nerves tightening with each passing mile. Something felt wrong. I should have hit another town by now, or at least an intersection. But no matter how far I went, the road remained the same, twisting through the trees, swallowed by shadows. Then I passed the second sign. This one was newer, still intact. The words painted in red made my stomach tightening. Turn around now. I slowed down, my fingers tightening around the wheel. My headlights cut through the mist, creeping in from the trees, revealing the cracked pavement stretching ahead. I told myself it was just a prank, some local kids messing with travelers. Then I passed the third sign. The paint was fresher. The message was shorter. Don't look back. I swallowed hard, my hands sweaty on the wheel. I wasn't the kind of person who scared easily, but something about this felt off. The headlights flickered for a brief second, and I thought I saw movement in the trees, a flash of something pale. I kept driving. Then I passed the fourth sign. There was no message this time, just a handprint smeared in red, fingers stretched wide, as if someone had pressed their palm against the metal in a moment of terror. I was about to hit the brakes, about to turn around and head back the way I came, when I caught something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, right where I had driven past. I slammed the brakes, my heart pounding. My breath came in ragged gasps as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The figure was tall, impossibly thin. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, oh God, its eyes were empty pits, black as the night sky. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching me. A cold sweat broke over my skin. I remembered the sign, don't look back. I forced my hands back on the wheel. My instinct screamed at me to drive, to get out of here as fast as possible. I pressed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward. I kept my eyes locked ahead, refusing to glance at the mirror again. The road twisted, the trees closing in. The mist thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns. My headlights flickered again, and for a brief gut-wrenching moment, I swore I saw figures standing just beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. I kept driving. Then I saw the fifth sign. The words were smeared, almost unreadable, as if someone had been in a hurry when they wrote it. It knows you're here. A choked noise escaped my throat. My pulse pounded against my skull. Then my radio crackled to life. Static. A voice whispered through the speakers, so faint I could barely make it out. Don't stop, keep driving. It's behind you. My blood turned to ice. A thud. Something hit the roof of my car. I swallowed a scream. My knuckles turned white on the wheel. As I pressed the gas harder, the car surged forward. Another thud. Closer this time. Something was crawling on my car. I could hear the scraping fingernails dragging across the metal. A slow, deliberate movement, like whatever was up there knew I was trapped. I didn't dare look up. The road stretched on, endless and suffocating. I was driving faster than I should, my headlights barely cutting through the mist. The forest blurred past in streaks of black and gray. Then I saw the sixth sign. You can't leave. My breath caught. My headlights flickered. Then, in front of me, a figure, standing in the middle of the road. It was the same thing I had seen before, but now it was closer, too close. I swerved. The car skidded, tires screeching against the pavement. My heart leapt into my throat as I fought for control, but the road was slick, the mist distorting everything. Then I was spinning. The world tilted, trees blurred past. My vision went white as my car slammed into something hard. Then silence. Darkness swallowed me whole. When I came to, my head throbbed. The windshield was cracked, and the car was half off the road, wedged between two trees. I sucked in a shaky breath. Then I heard it, the soft click of a car door opening. Not mine. Something was outside. The whispers returned, not from the radio this time, but from the forest. Dozens of voices overlapping, murmuring just beyond the trees. I turned my head, throat dry, stomach twisting. Something stood just outside my broken window, its face inches from the glass. It smiled. I screamed. The world twisted, and the last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the seventh sign. Welcome home. I grew up in a small coastal town, where the mist rolled in thick from the ocean, swallowing everything in its path. The fishermen had an old saying, when the fog comes heavy, stay inside. If you hear your name, don't answer. I always thought it was just superstition. That was before the night I learned the truth. It was early October, and the fog had been worse than usual. It crept in before sundown, lingering in the streets, curling around houses like ghostly fingers. The town grew silent when it came, people locking their doors, closing their blinds. I never understood why. Not until that night. I had just finished my shift at the diner and was walking home. The fog had swallowed Main Street, reducing everything to shadowy outlines. My footsteps echoed eerily as I passed shuttered storefronts. Then I heard it, a voice, soft, familiar, calling my name. Michael. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It came from somewhere in the fog, just ahead of me, though I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. It sounded like my mother's voice, but that was impossible. My mother had died 2 years ago. A chill slithered down my spine. My gut screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the diner, but something held me there, my feet rooted to the pavement. Then I saw movement in the mist, a shape, shifting just out of sight, tall, wrong. The voice came again, closer now. Michael, come here. My pulse pounded. It was her voice. I knew it was her. Every syllable, every cadence. It was exactly how she used to call me when I was a kid. But something about it felt like an echo, a distortion. I took a step back. The shape in the fog mirrored me. My stomach twisted. It was playing with me. And then I made the mistake. I answered, "Who's there?" Silence. The air grew heavy, pressing against my skin like a weight. The fog thickened, swirling unnaturally. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward me. The streetlights flickered. For the briefest moment, the fog parted, just enough for me to see what was standing there. And I wish I never had. It was tall, thin, its limbs too long, its fingers dragging along the pavement. Its skin was gray and stretched tight, like something that had been dead for a long time. But it was the face that made my blood turn to ice. It was my mother's face, or at least, it was trying to be. The features were there, the same eyes, the same gentle smile, but the skin didn't fit right, like it had been pulled too tight over the wrong bones. And the eyes, they were empty, black, bottomless. The thing grinned. Michael. It took a step forward. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the fog-blind streets, heart hammering, lungs burning. The voice followed, whispering my name in that sweet, familiar tone. But now there were more of them, Soft voices, calling, echoing from the mist. Too many voices. I reached my house and fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. The whispering was closer now, right behind me. I threw myself inside and slammed the door. Silence. My breath came in ragged gasps. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, a knock, soft, gentle. "Michael, let me in." I backed away from the door, my chest tightening. It was my mother's voice again. "I've missed you. Open the door, sweetheart." Tears burned in my eyes. I wanted so badly to believe it, but I knew. I stumbled back, grabbed the curtains, and yanked them shut. The knocking stopped, and then, it laughed, a sound that sent ice through my veins. Low, hollow, wrong. I pressed my hands over my ears. After what felt like hours, the whispering faded. The fog began to recede. The night grew silent. By morning, the town was back to normal. The sun was shining. The fog was gone. But I knew it would come again. And I knew it would keep calling my name. And next time, I might answer. I had always heard the stories about Blackwood Forest. The locals spoke in hushed voices, warning travelers not to go too deep past the tree line, especially after dark. They said there was something wrong in those woods, something ancient, something hungry. I never used to believe in those kinds of stories, until the night I found out they were true. It started when my friend Aaron invited me on a camping trip. "Come on, man," he said, grinning. "You need to get out of the city for a while. Fresh air, good company, a couple of beers under the stars. It'll be great." I should have said no, but I didn't. Instead, I packed my bag, loaded up on supplies, and drove out with Aaron and 2 other friends, Mark and Jess, into the deepest part of Blackwood Forest. The first day was perfect. We set up camp in a clearing, right at the edge of a massive dark ravine. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills, endless trees, and nothing but silence. No roads, no cell service, just us and the wilderness. That night, as we sat around the fire, Mark brought up the stories. "You guys ever hear about the hollow ones?" he asked, poking at the flames with a stick. Jess scoffed. "Oh God, here we go." Aaron chuckled. Yeah, I've heard the legends, old backwoods nonsense, but I was curious. "The hollow ones?" I asked. Mark smirked. "Yeah, the old folks say there's something in this forest, something that looks human but isn't." Jess rolled her eyes. "Oh come on, I'm serious," Mark insisted. "People who go too deep into Blackwood see things. They hear voices calling their names, and if you listen too long, well, they say the hollow ones take your skin. They wear you." A cold breeze rustled through the trees. The fire crackled. Aaron laughed. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." We all laughed, but the laughter didn't last long, because later that night, something screamed in the woods. It was distant, just past the ravine, but it was unlike any sound I had ever heard. Not an animal, not human, something in between. A low, warbling howl that sent ice through my veins. "Probably a coyote," Aaron mumbled, pulling his sleeping bag over his head. I tried to believe him, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning, things got worse. We found footprints, not human, not animal, but something in between. They were deep pressed into the damp earth, long clawed impressions, too wide to be human, too narrow to be a bear. Mark bent down, tracing the edges of the prints with his fingers. "Jesus," he whispered. "These are fresh." Something big had passed by our camp while we slept. Jess shivered. "I don't like this, guys. Maybe we should head back." Aaron scoffed. "Oh come on. It's probably just some weird animal. We'll be fine." But I wasn't convinced. And as the day wore on, the forest grew quieter. No birds, no insects, just silence. And then around midday, we found the cave. It was tucked into the side of the ravine, hidden behind a curtain of twisted roots. Dark, deep. The air around it was wrong, too cold. Mark grinned. "We have to check this out." Jess shook her head. "Absolutely not." But curiosity got the better of us. We stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something rotten. Then we saw them. The carvings, all over the cave walls etched into the stone, were faces, twisted, hollow-eyed, screaming. Aaron stepped closer, brushing his fingers over the deep grooves. What the hell is this? Then we heard it. A clicking sound. Slow, deliberate, coming from the darkness. Something was in there with us. We bolted. Jess screamed as her flashlight flickered, the beam catching a glimpse of something tall, something moving. Then the world exploded into chaos. Something lunged. I felt a rush of air, a flash of pale limbs, and those hollow, empty eyes. I ran. We all ran, bursting from the cave, scrambling up the ravine, tripping over roots, gasping for breath. And then, Aaron wasn't with us anymore. We stopped, turned, silence. Aaron, Jess called, her voice trembling. No answer, just the wind, rustling through the trees. Then, a whisper, from the cave, soft, familiar. Aaron, Jess gasped. Oh my God, it was his voice. But it wasn't him. We saw him then, or at least we thought it was him. He stood at the mouth of the cave, motionless, staring. His body was rigid. His skin looked wrong, like it didn't fit right. Then he smiled. But it wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, too full of teeth. Mark grabbed my arm. That's not Aaron. The thing in the cave stepped forward. I turned and ran. I never looked back. We made it back to camp, grabbed whatever we could, and tore through the forest toward the road. We never spoke about what we saw, never told the police, because deep down we knew Aaron was never coming back. And whatever it was that wore his skin, it wasn't done hunting. That night, back in town, as I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it, soft, gentle, calling my name, from the woods outside my window. Aaron. No, not Aaron. Never Aaron. The hollow ones are real, and they are waiting. There are places in this world where people aren't meant to go. The kind of places that don't show up on maps, where the trees grow too thick, and the air hangs heavy with unspoken warnings. The Appalachian Mountains are full of them. I learned that the hard way. It started when my cousin Wes asked me to come visit his cabin. Man, you need to get out here, he said over the phone. City life's messing with your head. A few nights in the mountains will do you some good. I wasn't so sure. Something about those mountains always felt off to me. But I hadn't seen Wes in years, and I figured a little time away wouldn't hurt. So I packed my bag, hopped in my truck, and started the long drive into the heart of the Appalachians. The roads wound like a snake, through endless stretches of forest. No streetlights, no gas stations, just mile after mile of towering trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. By the time I reached Wes's cabin, the sun had already started to dip behind the mountains. His place was isolated, just a simple wooden cabin buried deep in the woods, far from any town or main road, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. Wes greeted me with a grin and a slap on the back. Glad you made it, man. Thought the mountains might have swallowed you up. His voice was light, but his eyes held something else, something tired. That first night was normal. We grilled some steaks, drank a few beers, sat out on the porch, and listened to the sounds of the forest. But as the sky turned dark, and the crickets fell silent, Wes grew serious. Listen, he said, leaning forward. I gotta tell you something, and I need you to listen real careful. I frowned. All right. There's a rule out here, he said. When the sun goes down, you stay inside. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, you do not open that door. A chill ran down my spine. What are you talking about? Wes took a slow breath. There's things in these woods, cousin. Old things. They don't like being seen, but they'll come close sometimes. They'll call your name. They'll sound like someone you know. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. You're serious, I said. Wes just nodded. I laughed, shaking my head. Come on, man. That's just backwoods superstition. Wes's face didn't change. You'll believe me soon enough, he muttered. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. And then, just past midnight, I heard it. Soft, faint, somewhere out in the woods, just beyond the tree line. Someone was calling my name. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The voice was distant, almost familiar, like someone I knew. I glanced at the clock. 12:14 a.m. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind. But then I heard it again. Daniel, a woman's voice, soft, fragile. It sounded like my mother, but my mother was 300 miles away. I swallowed hard, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Stay inside, Wes had said. I tried to ignore it. I really did, but the voice came again. Closer. Daniel, help me. My stomach twisted. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. No service. The voice came a third time, just outside the cabin, right outside my window. Daniel, please. I turned my head, and that's when I saw it. Something tall, something wrong. It stood just beyond the porch light, where the shadows swallowed the trees. At first I thought it was a person, but then I noticed the way it moved. Too slow, too smooth, like a puppet on invisible strings. And its face, it was too familiar, too much like my mother's, but stretched, pulled too thin, the mouth too wide, the eyes too deep, a mask. I stopped breathing. The thing took a slow step forward, then another. Then, the porch light went out. I scrambled out of bed, heart hammering, and ran to Wes's room. I shook him awake, gasping, There's something outside." Wes's eyes flew open. He sat up fast, his face pale. "Did you open the door?" I shook my head. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." Then knock, knock, knock. A slow rhythmic tapping at the front door. Wes grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron. We did not move. The knock came again. "Daniel." My stomach turned to ice. The voice was closer now. It was at the door. Wes squeezed my wrist tighter. Then, just beneath his breath, he whispered, "That ain't your mother." I felt sick. The knock came again, harder this time. And then, the doorknob started to turn. We stayed frozen. Neither of us breathed. The door rattled. The thing outside pressed against it. I could hear it breathing. Low, wet, like something struggling to remember how lungs worked. Then, after a long moment, it laughed. A soft, breathy chuckle. And then, silence. The thing outside was gone. But I knew, deep down, I would never be the same. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, we packed our things and left that mountain behind. Wes never spoke about that night again, and I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the wind howls through the trees, I still hear it, knocking, calling my name, and laughing. I used to work the night shift at a gas station off a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place people only stopped at when they had no other choice, when their tank was running on fumes and they'd rather risk a sketchy pit stop than being stranded on the road. I worked there 5 nights a week, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was quiet most of the time, except for the occasional trucker or lost tourist looking for directions. We had security cameras, but they barely worked, and the flickering fluorescent lights outside cast more shadows than they chased away. I didn't mind the job, at least, not at first. It was mid-October when the weirdness started. The air had turned cold, and the nights stretched longer. The first time I noticed something off, it was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were dead. Hardly anyone stopped by. After midnight, I was behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine, when I heard it, a faint tapping on the glass. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. Tap, tap, slow, deliberate. I glanced up expecting to see a customer, but there was no one there, just the empty parking lot, the dim glow of the overhead lights, and the dense tree line just beyond the edge of the station. Then the motion sensor chime dinged. Someone, or something, had stepped inside. I straightened up, expecting to greet a late-night traveler, but when I looked around, the station was empty. "Hello," I called. No answer. I stepped around the counter, peering into the aisles. The shelves cast long shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move between them, something low to the ground, almost slinking. But when I turned the corner, there was nothing there. I shook it off. Maybe I was just tired. The next few nights were normal, until Friday, around 2 a.m., I was doing my usual rounds, checking the coolers and making sure everything was stocked, when the power flickered. Not unusual, the wiring in that place was ancient. But when the lights came back on, I noticed something strange. The security monitor showed a single frame of the parking lot. The timestamp was frozen at 2:03 a.m. And in the middle of the screen, standing just outside the door, was a shape, not a person, something taller, leaner, with joints that bent the wrong way, and it was looking right at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped out from the back room and peered through the glass doors. Nothing. The lot was empty. But when I checked the monitor again, the image was gone. The timestamp had resumed, like nothing had ever happened. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. The next night, I almost called in sick, but I needed the money, so I went in. At around 3 a.m., I saw it again. I was behind the counter when the motion sensor chimed. My heart jumped, but when I looked up, the store was empty. Then just outside, under the flickering gas station sign, I saw movement. Something was crouched near the pumps. At first I thought it was an animal, but then it stood up. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs moved in a way that made my stomach turn. I ducked behind the counter, peeking over the edge. The thing stepped closer. Its face, if you could call it that, was long, featureless, except for two hollow black voids where eyes should be. It pressed a hand against the glass door. Its fingers were too long. The chime went off. It was inside. I didn't breathe, didn't move. I stayed crouched behind the counter, listening. It was quiet at first, just the faint hum of the refrigerators, the buzz of the lights. Then, scrape. Something dragged against the floor. I clenched my teeth, squeezing my eyes shut. I could hear it breathing, a wet, rattling sound, like something struggling to suck in air through a throat too narrow. Then, silence. I don't know how long I stayed there. When I finally gathered the courage to peek over the counter, the store was empty. The doors were locked. The parking lot was still, but the glass right where it had pressed its hand was smeared with something dark. I quit the next morning. I don't know what that thing was. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I drive past that gas station late at night, I swear I see something standing just beyond the glow of the streetlights, watching, waiting. I never look too long, and I never stop. I used to work as a night janitor at an old high school. It wasn't a bad job. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and I didn't have to deal with people, just me, my mop, and the echo of my own footsteps through the long empty halls. The school was old, built in the 1940s. They'd renovated parts of it over the years, but some sections still felt ancient. The basement, for example, hadn't changed much since the school first opened. It was a maze of old storage rooms, a long abandoned fallout shelter, and boiler rooms that hissed and groaned like something alive. I hated that basement. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Every night, I had a routine. Start on the first floor, sweep and mop the halls, empty the trash, clean the bathrooms, then move up to the second floor. The gym and locker rooms were last. The basement, I avoided it as much as I could. At first, nothing weird happened. It was just a job, lonely, but peaceful. Then, after a couple of months, I started noticing things. It began with the intercom. One night, around midnight, I was mopping near the front office when the intercom crackled to life. A faint burst of static, then silence. I froze, listening. Nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to work. But an hour later, it happened again. Static, a soft click. Then, just barely, I swore I heard breathing. The next night, it happened again. And the night after that, I asked the daytime staff about it. But they just shrugged. Old wiring, they said. It happens. I wanted to believe that. But then the doors started opening on their own. One night, I was in the second floor hallway, cleaning the windows. The whole place was silent, just the occasional creak of the old building settling. I turned to grab my spray bottle, and when I looked back, one of the classroom doors, one I knew had been closed, was open. Not just unlocked, wide open. I stared at it, my pulse hammering. The lights inside were off, but the room felt wrong. like someone was standing just inside the doorway watching me. I walked up slowly, trying to shake the feeling. I reached for the door handle. Slam! The door shut right in my face. I jumped back, nearly dropping my supplies. My breath came fast and uneven. There was no way a draft had done that. I stood there, heart pounding, for what felt like forever. Finally, I forced myself to grab the handle and pull the door open again. The room was empty. I checked every desk, every corner. Nothing. But when I turned to leave, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. All the chairs, the ones that had been neatly tucked under the desks, were now slightly pulled out, like someone had just been sitting in each one. I didn't clean the second floor that night. I wish I could say that was the worst of it, but the basement was worse. Much worse. I avoided it as much as I could, but once a week, I had to take supplies down there. The storage rooms held old desks, broken projectors, and boxes of forgotten textbooks. The air was thick with dust and mildew, and the lights flickered constantly. One night, I was hauling a box of cleaning rags down the stairs when I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from deeper in the basement. I froze on the last step, my breath catching. No one was supposed to be down here. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded too loud, bouncing off the concrete walls. Silence. I set the box down and took a cautious step forward. The hallway stretched ahead of me, dimly lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. Storage rooms lined both sides. Then, a door creaked open. I turned so fast, I nearly lost my balance. One of the storage rooms, about 20 feet ahead, now stood ajar. It had been closed when I walked in. I was sure of it. I took a step back, and then, from the darkness of the room, I heard it. A whisper, not words, just a low rasping sound, like breath scraping against something dry. Then, the lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw something move inside the room. I ran. I didn't care about the supplies. I didn't care about my shift. I bolted up the stairs, not stopping until I was back on the main floor. I locked the basement door behind me. The rest of the night, I sat in the front office, jumpy at every little sound. I quit the next morning. The principal didn't even seem surprised when I handed in my resignation. He just nodded and said, "Not everyone can handle the night shift. I don't know what's down in that basement, but I'll never go back to find out." I grew up in a small town where nothing much happened. A quiet place where the biggest event of the year was the county fair, and everyone knew each other by name. But just outside the town limits, past the old church and the winding dirt road, sat the graveyard. People didn't talk about it much. It was old, really old. Some of the headstones dated back to the 1700s, their names worn away by time and rain. The newer section was well kept, with trimmed grass and polished headstones. But the back half, that was different. The trees grew thicker there, gnarled roots breaking through the earth like skeletal fingers. The ground was uneven, littered with sunken graves and leaning tombstones. The air always felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp moss and decaying leaves. People said that part of the graveyard was forgotten, but I knew better. It wasn't forgotten, it was avoided. I had 3 close friends growing up: Mark, Jesse, and Tyler. We were inseparable, always looking for something to do in our boring town. And one summer night, after too many beers and too many dumb ideas, we dared each other to spend the night in the graveyard. Not the front part, the back. Tyler was the first to speak up. "My grandpa used to say there's something wrong with that place," he muttered, glancing at his beer cane. "He used to be the groundskeeper. Said he'd hear voices, see figures moving between the stones at night." Jesse rolled his eyes. "Come on, man. You really believe that?" Tyler hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know, but I wouldn't sleep there." Mark grinned. "Then you lose the bet." And just like that, it was settled. We packed some flashlights, sleeping bags, and a couple more beers, then hopped the rusted fence just after midnight. The difference between the graveyard during the day and at night was staggering. The air was colder than it should have been for a summer night. The crickets that had been chirping non-stop suddenly went silent. As we walked deeper into the graveyard, the trees swayed, whispering in a wind I couldn't feel. We set up camp near an old crumbling mausoleum. Jesse joked about ghosts while Mark cracked open another beer. But Tyler was quiet. He kept glancing around, his grip tight on his flashlight. That's when we heard it. A whisper, low, raspy. Not words, just the sound of something breathing. Mark turned his flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching long between the graves. Wind, Jesse muttered. Or an animal. But it didn't sound like the wind, and it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. Then the smell hit us. Rot, thick cloying rot, like something had been dead and baking in the sun for days. Tyler gagged. What the hell is that? We swung our flashlights around, looking for a dead animal, but the graveyard was empty, just stone and earth and that horrible smell. And then the whisper came again, only this time it was closer, right behind us. We spun around but nothing, just that old mausoleum, its stone door cracked slightly open. Mark laughed nervously. Okay, this place is definitely creepy. Tyler wasn't laughing. Jesse smirked and stepped toward the mausoleum. Think there's anything in there? Tyler grabbed his arm. Don't. Jesse shook him off. Come on, man. It's just a stupid bet. Before we could stop him, he pressed his fingers against the stone and pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, dust spilling out in thick clouds. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness inside. The air was even colder near the entrance, like stepping into a freezer. Jesse took a step inside, then another. We held our breath as his light swept over the interior. Dust, a stone slab, some crumbled bones in the corner. Nothing else. Jesse turned back, grinning. See, nothing. Then behind him, a shape, dark, moving, not fast, not sudden, just a slow looming shadow rising from the farthest corner of the mausoleum. I tried to speak, to warn him, but my throat locked up. Jesse saw our faces. He started to turn. Then the whisper came again, louder, right next to his ear. Jesse screamed. He stumbled back, tripped over the threshold, and hit the ground hard. Tyler grabbed his arm and yanked him away as Mark slammed the mausoleum door shut. For a moment, none of us spoke. Jesse sat there, breathing hard, his face pale. Then he stammered. There was Maggie. There was Maggie. But we already knew. We grabbed our stuff and ran. The trees loomed overhead, twisting into skeletal shapes. The gravestones seemed closer together, the ground uneven beneath our feet. And behind us, footsteps, not echoing, not human. Something was moving between the graves. Something heavy, slow, purposeful. Then Jesse screamed again. I turned just in time to see him jerked backward. His ankle caught on something unseen. He hit the ground, clawing at the dirt as his flashlight rolled away. Tyler and I grabbed him, pulling with all our strength. And for a moment it felt like something else was pulling back. Something cold. Then Jesse broke free. We didn't stop running until we reached the rusted fence, practically throwing ourselves over it. Then, silence. The graveyard stood behind us, dark and still. The trees whispered, but nothing else moved. No footsteps, no whispers. And yet, I swear I saw something standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. We never talked about that night again. Jesse moved away for college, and never came back. Mark stopped drinking. Tyler refused to drive past the graveyard. Me, I still live here, but I never take that road at night, and I never go near the graveyard, because sometimes, on cold, quiet nights, I still hear the whispers. I grew up in the countryside, surrounded by rolling fields, dense patches of forest, and long dirt roads that stretched for miles. My family owned a farm, passed down through generations, a place where the land was both our livelihood and our prison. I say prison because we never left. Not really. There were rules that had been in place long before I was born, and they all revolved around the fields. At first I thought they were just old superstitions, stories my grandfather told to keep us from wandering too far at night. But I learned the hard way that the rules weren't just for show, they were for survival. My grandfather was a strict man. He ran the farm like a well-oiled machine, waking us before dawn and working us until sunset. But no matter how exhausted we were, He always made sure we followed the rules. Never go into the fields after dark. If you see something moving between the stalks, ignore it. If you hear whispering, know you didn't. Always shut and lock the barn doors before sundown. If the cattle start acting strange, don't look them in the eyes. If you hear footsteps on the roof, don't acknowledge them. I thought they were silly, until the night I found out why they existed. Something in the fields. It was the summer before I left for college. I had spent my whole life on that farm, dreaming of escaping it, of moving to a place where the only things growing weren't just rows of corn and wheat. That night, I had stayed out late, lying in the grass near the barn, staring at the sky. The stars were so clear out there, untouched by city lights. I was so lost in thought that I didn't realize how much time had passed. The sun had gone down, and the fields weren't quiet anymore. At first I thought it was just the wind, rustling the stalks, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving between the rows of corn. I sat up, heart pounding. Maybe it was my dad, or my grandfather checking on the crops. But the longer I listened, the more I realized the footsteps weren't coming toward the house. They were circling, pacing. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, shining it toward the fields. The tall stalks swayed gently, the golden tips shifting in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, just beyond the reach of my light, something moved, a shape, barely visible through the gaps in the stalks. It was tall, too tall, and it was watching me. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I turned on my heel and bolted for the house, not daring to look back. I locked the door behind me, panting, my skin crawling. That's when I heard it, a sound I will never forget, a low, guttural whisper, coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't words, not at first, just a series of clicks and mutters, like someone trying to mimic speech. Then, "Let me in." I backed away from the door. My grandfather's words rang in my head. "If you hear whispering, know you didn't." I squeezed my eyes shut, plugged my ears. The whispering continued. "You left the barn open." My breath caught in my throat. No, I hadn't. Had I? I turned, staring out the window toward the barn. The doors were slightly open, swaying in the wind. The cattle were still, too still. Their heads were all turned in the same direction, toward the fields. And then, one by one, they started walking toward the open doors, like they were being called, like they had no choice. I should have stayed inside. I know that now, but I wasn't thinking. I just knew that if I lost our cattle, my grandfather would never forgive me. I grabbed my shotgun from the rack by the door and stepped onto the porch. The air was thick, suffocating. As I moved toward the barn, the whispering was gone now, but the footsteps, they weren't. The moment I stepped onto the dirt path, I heard them, behind me, matching my pace. I walked faster. The footsteps quickened. I reached the barn and slammed the doors shut, locking them tight. My hands were shaking as I turned, flashlight trembling in my grip. The cornfields loomed before me, stretching into the night, and standing just beyond the first row was a figure, tall, gaunt. Its skin was the color of dry, cracked earth. Its limbs were too long, fingers like twisted roots. It had no eyes, just hollow, gaping sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. It tilted its head, lips parting, and then it smiled. My stomach turned. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run. Then it took a step forward, and suddenly, the entire field came alive. Shapes moved between the stalks, dozens of them, shifting in the darkness. The corn stalks bent and swayed as they passed, as if whispering to one another. I ran. I didn't look back. I locked every door, every window. I sat in the kitchen, shotgun in my lap, heart pounding. Outside, the night was silent, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. I never told my grandfather what I saw, but the next morning, when he saw the barn doors locked and the cattle unharmed, he just nodded, as if he already knew. I left for college a few months later, but the farm never truly left me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispering, still feel those hollow eyes watching me from the dark. And sometimes, when I visit home and stand by the porch at night, I swear I see them, lurking at the edge of the fields, waiting for me to break the rules again. I never really feared school lockdowns. They were just drills, annoying breaks in the day when we had to crouch in the dark and pretend we were hiding from some faceless threat. But the last lockdown I ever experienced, it wasn't a drill, and it still haunts me. It happened on a Friday, late in the afternoon. The final bell was less than 15 minutes away when the intercom crackled to life. At first, the static buzzed without a voice, just a strange dragging sound, like something heavy, scraping against a hard surface. Then, finally, the principal's voice came through, but something was off. "This is a lockdown," he said, too slow, almost uncertain. "This is not a drill. Please follow all lockdown procedures immediately." The classroom fell silent. My teacher, Mr. Dawson, hesitated, staring at the intercom like he expected more. But the static just kept hissing. He quickly shut the blinds, turned off the lights, and motioned for us to move to the corner of the room. The energy shifted from casual to tense in an instant. This wasn't a drill, but nothing about it felt normal. As we crouched in the dimness, the hallway outside remained eerily quiet. No running footsteps, no teachers locking doors, just that faint static-laced sound still hissing over the intercom. That was when we heard the knock. It was soft at first, just a gentle rapping against the door, like someone was politely requesting entry. Mr. Dawson stiffened, pressing a finger to his lips. None of us dared to breathe. Then the knocking got louder. It became frantic, insistent, sharp, rattling thuds that shook the door on its hinges. My pulse pounded as I gripped my friend Jonah's arm. The door handle twitched. Something was trying to open it. I expected to hear a voice, a demand to let them in, but there was only silence. Then, a whisper, not words, just a sound, breathy and unnatural, slithering beneath the door. My skin crawled. Jonah turned to me, his eyes wide with terror. That was when the intercom crackled again. The voice wasn't the principal's anymore. It wasn't anyone's. It was layered, distorted, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping and warping. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with an unnatural pressure. And then the knocking stopped. For a long time no one moved. Mr. Dawson held his breath, his fingers still gripping the desk for support. The silence stretched on. Then the intercom screeched. A high-pitched wail of static ripped through the room, making us all flinch. "Come out." The voice was right outside the door now. Mr. Dawson motioned frantically for us to stay still. But one of the students, Nina, let out a strangled gasp, clapping her hands over her mouth too late. The door handle twisted violently. The door shouldn't have been able to open. It was locked, but somehow, the handle turned all the way, and the door creaked open an inch. A shadow loomed in the gap. I couldn't see details, just an outline. But something was wrong about it. It was tall, taller than any teacher at the school, its head nearly scraping the top of the doorway. Its limbs were too long, joints bending unnaturally, like it had too many bones in the wrong places. The door began to open wider. That was when the emergency lights flickered on. A siren began blaring through the school, an alarm we had never heard before. The shadow froze, then it twitched. Not a normal movement, not the kind you'd expect from a person. It jerked, snapping out of sight in an instant, and then it was gone. We stayed there for what felt like hours, huddled in silence, waiting for footsteps, voices, anything. Eventually, an actual announcement came through the intercom. This time it was our real principal. "Students and faculty," he said, his voice shaking, "authorities have arrived. Stay in your rooms until further instruction." We were escorted out of the school one classroom at a time. Police officers filled the hallways, their faces pale, their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. But they wouldn't tell us what had happened. They didn't say who or what had been in the school. The news reports were vague. Unidentified intruder, ongoing investigation. But there was no suspect, no break-in, no evidence of anything human. The school closed for 2 weeks after that. When we finally returned, there were new security cameras, reinforced doors, and rumors that the police had sealed off certain parts of the school permanently. But no one ever explained the voice on the intercom, or what had been knocking on our door. It started with a road trip, a long monotonous drive through the heart of nowhere, the kind of endless highway that cuts through vast empty land, where time seems to stretch unnaturally. I was driving through the back roads of a small rural town, the kind where gas stations were few and far between, and the only signs of life were distant farmhouses, barely visible beyond the endless fields. The sun was setting, and with it came a dense fog, rolling in thick and heavy, like an ocean of mist swallowing the land whole. I had never seen fog like this before. It was too thick, too unnatural. It poured across the road in twisting tendrils, curling around the trees and telephone poles, swallowing everything beyond the reach of my headlights. I slowed down. The road felt different now, quieter, too empty. No distant hum of insects, no rustling trees, nothing but the sound of my tires against the cracked asphalt. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Then I saw it, a figure in the fog. At first, I thought it was a deer, some animal wandering across the road, but as I got closer, my stomach twisted. It was a person, a tall, lanky figure standing completely still in the middle of the highway, facing me. Their features were obscured by the fog, but something about their silhouette was wrong. Their limbs were too long, their posture unnatural, like they were being held up by invisible strings. I pressed the brakes, my heart hammering. The figure didn't move. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The headlights barely cut through the fog, but as the beams washed over them, I saw it. Their head was tilted at an impossible angle. I didn't even have time to react before the radio flickered on, blasting static so loud it rattled my skull. The sound screeched through the car like nails on glass. My fingers scrambled for the dial, twisting it desperately, but the static grew louder. Then, through the noise, a voice. "Keep driving." It was barely a whisper, hidden beneath the static, but it was there. "Don't look away." My breath hitched. The figure was closer now. I hadn't seen them move, but they were right there, standing just inches from my bumper, their hands limp at their sides, head still twisted at that impossible angle. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding straight toward them, but as soon as my headlights passed over the figure, they were gone, vanished into the fog. I didn't slow down. My hands were shaking, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The radio was still crackling, the voice whispering something I couldn't understand. Then suddenly, silence. The fog thinned in an instant, vanishing as if it had never been there. I was back on the highway, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me beneath a clear, starless sky. I exhaled shakily, my fingers trembling against the wheel. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was a trick of the light. Then my phone buzzed, a notification, an airdrop from an unknown sender. There was a single image, a photo of me, sitting in my car, taken from just outside the driver's side window. I didn't stop driving. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't slow down, not until I reached the next town, where the neon glow of a rundown gas station finally broke the suffocating darkness. I pulled in, hands still shaking, chest heaving. The clerk looked up as I stumbled inside, sweat soaking through my shirt. "You okay, man?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just a long drive." He nodded but didn't seem convinced. I grabbed a bottle of water and went to pay. But as he rang me up, I noticed something behind him, a small TV screen, the feed coming from an old security camera mounted outside. The grainy footage showed my car, and a figure standing just behind it, motionless, watching. My stomach dropped. I turned, spinning toward the door, but there was nothing there, only the quiet hum of the gas station, only the empty parking lot, only the long stretch of highway disappearing into the night. I didn't go back to my car right away. I stood there in the fluorescent glow of the gas station, heart pounding, watching the monitor as the figure slowly faded from view. The clerk glanced at the screen, then back at me. "You're not the first," he muttered. I looked at him sharply. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Others have come through here. Said they saw something on the road. Something in the fog. A cold dread slithered through me. I turned to the window, staring at my reflection in the glass. The parking lot was still empty. My car sat there, waiting, and yet, somewhere in the darkness, just beyond the glow of the gas station lights, I could feel it, watching, waiting, and I knew, deep in my bones, it wasn't finished with me yet. I never wanted to move to the countryside. I was a city guy, born and raised, and the thought of trading in high-rise apartments and bustling streets for endless fields and silent nights didn't sit right with me. But when my grandfather passed and left us his farm, my parents saw it as an opportunity, a fresh start, they called it. I called it a mistake. The house was old, a creaking, two-story farmhouse surrounded by miles of cornfields. The nearest neighbor was a 15-minute drive away. No streetlights, no traffic, just an ocean of swaying corn under a never-ending sky. The first thing I noticed when we moved in was how quiet it was. Not peaceful, unnerving, like the whole world had been put on mute. No sirens, no voices, not even the hum of distant cars, just the wind, whispering through the fields. Then on the second night, I heard something else, a rustling, not from inside the house, but from outside. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The window was open, and through it I could hear the sound of something moving through the cornstalks. A slow, deliberate shuffling. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard the breathing. Deep, ragged, too heavy to be human. I crept to the window, peering out into the moonlit fields. The corn swayed gently in the breeze, golden stalks rustling together, like a sea of whispers. Then something moved. A dark figure, just at the edge of the field. Too tall, too thin. It stood between the rows of corn, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching the house, watching me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering. I told myself it was a trick of the light, some shadow cast by the moon. But deep down I knew better, because the next morning, I found footprints in the dirt, long, clawed footprints. They led from the edge of the field to my window. I told my parents. They brushed it off. Probably just a coyote, Dad said, or a deer. But deer don't walk on two legs. That night, I locked my window, pulled the curtains tight, told myself it was nothing. Then, just past midnight, a knock, not on the door, on my window. Soft, rhythmic, a deliberate tap, tap, against the glass. I lay frozen in bed, my breath shallow, heart thundering in my chest. Then a voice, let me in. It wasn't human. It was wrong, too deep, too guttural, like something trying to mimic speech, but not quite getting it right. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking came again, harder this time. I know you're awake. A cold dread seeped into my bones. My body refused to move, paralyzed with fear. Then, scraping, long, slow scrapes against the glass. Claws. I clenched my eyes shut. Minutes passed. Hours. Eventually the noise stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I checked the window. There were scratch marks in the glass. I begged my parents to leave. They laughed it off, said I was letting my imagination run wild. But that night, it came back. Not to my window, to the front door. The handle jiggled. Then, slowly it turned. The door was locked. Thank God. But then the whispering began. I can smell you. A shadow passed by the window. I clutched the covers, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. Then, a sound I will never forget. A long, inhuman howl, rising into the night, like a scream from something that had never been human. And then, silence. The next morning, the front porch was covered in footprints. The doorframe was splintered, not broken but pushed inward, as if something had tried to force its way inside. And in the dirt just beyond the porch was a single severed deer's head. Its mouth was stretched open in a silent scream. My parents finally believed me. We left that same day. We never looked back. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear the knocking. I never should have taken the shortcut through Black Hollow. That stretch of road had been abandoned for decades. It ran through the deep woods at the edge of town, a twisting, cracked path swallowed by the forest. People used to live out there, back when logging camps and mining settlements dotted the Appalachian foothills. But those places were long gone, their remains hidden beneath tangled vines and rotting wood. Locals refused to go near it. I should have listened to them. It was fall, the time of year when the Appalachian forest turned to fire. The trees were a sea of red and gold, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. My job had me driving late, delivering supplies to out-of-the-way places, and on that night, I was already behind schedule. I didn't want to take the long road. I should have. The second I turned onto Black Hollow Road, I felt it, that awful gut-deep sensation that something wasn't right. The trees pressed too close. The headlights barely cut through the thick, unnatural fog that had settled over the road. My tires crunched over fallen leaves, and for a while, that was the only sound. Then, the radio cut out. No static, no signal, just silence. And that was when I saw it. A man, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed the brakes so hard, I nearly sent myself through the windshield. My heart lodged in my throat. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at me. The headlights caught his features. A tall, gaunt man, with skin stretched too tight over his bones. His clothes were old-fashioned, black and tattered, like something out of a Civil War portrait. And his eyes were all wrong. Not milky, not glowing, just empty, black as the void. My gut screamed at me to hit the gas and get the hell out of there. But my hands refused to move. The man raised one bony hand and pointed at me. Then his mouth stretched open, far too wide, like a wound splitting down his face. And he screamed. Not a human scream, not even an animal scream. It was a sound I can't describe. Something primal, something wrong, something that burrowed into my skull and took root. I broke free from my paralysis and slammed the car into reverse. My tires screeched as I backed up, gravel flying. And then, the man vanished, gone, like he had never been there at all. I didn't waste time. I yanked the wheel, spun the car around and floored it back the way I came. My chest heaved, my hands shook. Then I heard it, a thump on the roof, then another, and another, like something crawling. I didn't look, I didn't want to see, but in the rearview mirror, I saw the trees moving, not swaying in the wind, moving, bending, twisting, their trunks shifting in unnatural ways. Then the whispers started, not in my head, in the car. They slithered through the air, brushing against my ears, hissing in voices that were not my own. I stomped on the gas, the speedometer needle shaking. The road twisted, but I barely saw it. I was too busy watching the thing that was now crawling down my windshield. The man, or whatever he was upside down, his face pressed against the glass, grinning too wide, his jaw unhinged, and in the space where his throat should have been, I can't describe it. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything. It was just wrong. I screamed, veering the car violently, trying to shake him off. Then, blackness. I woke up to daylight. The car was in a ditch. The windshield was shattered, and the road, gone. I was in the middle of the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees. No road, no sign of Black Hollow. I should have been dead, but I wasn't. And the worst part, when I checked my dashboard camera later, the footage was missing, all except for the last 2 seconds. A grainy flickering image of the road ahead, and a face staring back at me through the windshield, still grinning. And then, darkness. I grew up in northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. It's a place of endless forests, freezing winters, and an unsettling silence that settles over the land like a heavy blanket. But if you ask the old folks, they'll tell you there's something else out there, something that stalks the deep woods, a hunger that never dies. I never believed the stories, not until that winter, not until we found the cabin. It was mid-December when my friend Jack called me. He and a few others, Luke, Danny, and Mara, were planning a winter hike through Blackwood Forest. We had grown up together, and Jack had always been the reckless one, constantly pushing us into places we shouldn't go. Blackwood was one of those places. The forest stretched for miles, mostly untouched, apart from an old fire road that hadn't been used in decades. People used to live out there, trapping and logging, but they were gone now. Jack's plan was simple: spend 3 nights deep in the woods, off trail, and make it back before the next big snowfall. I should have said no. I should have listened to my gut, but I went anyway. The first day was uneventful. We hiked through snow-draped pines, the silence only broken by our boots crunching through the ice. The sky was a deep gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. That night, we made camp in a small clearing and built a fire. The cold bit at our fingers, but the flames kept us warm. That was when Mara brought it up. The Wendigo, she said, staring into the fire. Ever heard of it? Luke scoffed. That old legend. Come on. Mara ignored him. It's not just a legend. People have gone missing out here for centuries. Hunters, loggers, hikers. Danny shivered, pulling his coat tighter. They say it's a spirit of hunger. Mara continued. A thing that was once human, but got lost in the cold, and turned into something else. She looked at me. You believe in it? I hesitated. I don't know, I admitted, but I know this place gives me the creeps. That night, I barely slept. Something about the trees felt wrong, like they were watching us, listening. The second day, we went deeper. By mid-afternoon, the snowfall got heavier. Thick flakes drifted down in silence, swallowing the world. And that's when we found the cabin. It was old, abandoned for decades, maybe longer. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the walls were gray with rot. Jack, of course, wanted to check it out. Danny and Mara were against it. Luke thought it was badass. I just felt uneasy. But the storm was getting worse, and we needed shelter. So we went inside. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. The floor creaked beneath our boots, and the walls were covered in deep scratches. Animal scratches, I told myself. At least I hoped they were. There were bones in the fireplace, old ones, and something etched into the wooden beams above it. A word was I. Indigo. No one spoke. Jack made some joke, but his voice sounded forced. We decided to stay the night. It was the worst mistake of our lives. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. A low scraping noise, like something dragging its claws along the cabin walls. I sat up, heart pounding. The others were still asleep, their breath fogging in the cold air. Then I heard it. A whisper, not a voice. Something dry, cracking, like wind through dead leaves. My blood turned to ice. Slowly I reached for my flashlight and shined it at the window. Something was staring back at me. A face, but not a human one. It had the sunken features of a corpse, stretched too tight over an elongated skull. Its eyes were milky white, reflecting the dim light like an animal's. Its mouth was too wide, its lips cracked and bleeding, and the antlers, they curled from its head like twisted branches, blackened and splintered. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, it spoke, a single word. Heisho ol wid. The next few moments were a blur. I must have screamed, because suddenly, the others were awake. Jack grabbed the rifle. Luke was cursing. Danny was crying. The thing outside began to move. Not walking, crawling, climbing the walls, its claws scraping against the logs. The wind outside howled. And then the door burst open. I don't remember running. I don't remember grabbing my pack or plunging into the freezing woods. I only remember the feeling of something behind me, chasing, hunting. We ran blindly through the snow, the trees twisting around us. The storm had swallowed the sky, and behind us, I heard footsteps that weren't footsteps. Too fast, too many legs. Danny was the first to go. 1 second, he was there. The next he was screaming. Something dragged him into the dark, his body vanishing beneath the trees. We didn't stop, didn't dare. We ran until our lungs burned. And then, silence. No wind, no pursuer, only an endless expanse of white. And that's when I realized we were lost. By the time we stumbled out of the woods, the sun was rising. Jack was missing 2 fingers from frostbite. Luke had a gash across his chest, Though he didn't remember how he got it, Danny was gone. The search teams never found him. The official report said he froze to death. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And sometimes, in the dead of winter, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear it whisper my name. Still hungry. Growing up in eastern Kentucky, I always heard stories about Devil's Hollow. It was one of those places people didn't talk about too much, not because they didn't believe in the stories, but because they did. They said something lived in the hollow, something old, something that didn't belong to this world. I never put much stock in ghost stories, but that was before the night my uncle went missing. That was before I saw it with my own eyes. It happened in late October, when the woods were thick with fog, and the first bite of winter was creeping into the air. My Uncle Ray was a tough old bastard, ex-military, no nonsense, and about as superstitious as a brick. He ran a small hunting cabin deep in Devil's Hollow, renting it out to tourists who didn't know better. One night, he didn't come home. His truck was still there, parked outside the cabin. His rifle was inside, but Ray was gone. No sign of a struggle, no blood, just emptiness. The sheriff organized a search party. My dad, a few of the locals, and I went out into the woods with flashlights and rifles, calling his name. We didn't find him, but we found something else. Near the creek, about half a mile from the cabin, we found footprints. They started normal, Ray's boots in the mud, leading away from the cabin. But after a few yards, the tracks changed. They became longer, like he had started running. And then suddenly, they weren't human anymore. They stretched into something twisted, something with long, clawed toes and deep impressions, like whatever made them had more weight than it should. I felt my stomach turn. The others saw it too. The sheriff muttered something under his breath and motioned for us to keep moving. I wanted to turn back, but we didn't. We should have. It was past midnight when we found the clearing. The trees opened up into a wide stretch of dead grass, and in the middle of it was a tree, or what looked like one. It was twisted and blackened. Its bark split open like a mouth full of rotten teeth. Around its base were bones, dozens of them. Some were animal, some were not. And there, hanging from the lowest branch, was my uncle's coat, but not his body. The search party went dead silent. No one spoke, no one breathed. Then, the tree moved, not from the wind. It breathed, a slow rattling inhale, like something old and dying. Then we heard it, a voice, but it wasn't human. It was low, stretched, distorted, as if something was trying to mimic speech, but didn't understand how. It whispered my uncle's name, Raze, and then, it stepped forward. I don't know how to describe what I saw. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs too long and a body that looked half decayed, half alive. Its skin was the color of ash, its mouth full of jagged yellowed teeth that clicked together as it moved. And its eyes, God, its eyes, they were empty, not black, not hollow, just wrong, like looking into something that was never meant to be seen by humans. It took a single step toward us, and the sheriff opened fire. The gunshots ripped through the silence, but the thing didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it laughed, a dry, broken sound, like wind through a dead forest. And then it moved, faster than anything should move. 1 second it was at the tree. The next it was in front of us. My dad grabbed my arm and ran. The others scattered. I don't remember much after that. Just branches tearing at my skin. My own breath ragged in my ears. The sound of something following us. I swear, at one point I heard it right behind me, whispering my uncle's name, Rade. By the time we made it back to the trucks, half the search party was missing. They were never found. Not a single trace. The sheriff never spoke about that night again. None of them did. As for me, I never went back to Devil's Hollow. I never will, because sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear it. That voice, whispering my name. There's something about the woods at night that never sits right with me. Even as a kid, I hated how the darkness seemed to press in, how the trees looked like silent figures standing in wait. My dad used to take me camping every summer, swearing it would make me tougher. but I never got over the feeling that something was out there. It wasn't until last year that I learned I had been right all along. My friend Ethan and I had planned a weekend camping trip deep in the Black Ridge Forest, a massive stretch of wilderness with barely any marked trails. Ethan was an experienced outdoorsman, the kind of guy who could build a fire from nothing and navigate without a map. I wasn't, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. We set up camp by a small creek, miles away from civilization. It was perfect, clear sky, crisp air, no sign of other people, just us and nature. By nightfall we had a fire going, cooking cheap hot dogs and talking about nothing. The silence of the woods was heavy, broken only by the crackling flames and the distant chirping of insects. Then the forest went quiet, not gradually, instantly, like someone had hit the mute button on the world. No wind, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. Ethan and I glanced at each other. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "There's nothing to hear," he muttered. "Exactly, and that was the problem." A low snap echoed from the tree line behind us. We both turned. Nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of our fire. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the night, illuminating gnarled trunks and tangled undergrowth. Then, for half a second, I thought I saw it. Something pale, something tall, standing between the trees. Then the light passed, and it was gone. My chest tightened. "Did you see?" A loud crash interrupted me. Something huge was moving in the woods. Ethan swore under his breath. "Probably a deer," he muttered, though his grip on the flashlight was tight. I wanted to believe him. I really did, but I knew something wasn't right. Then, the breathing started. At first I thought it was mine. That short, ragged inhaling, like someone struggling to catch their breath. But it was coming from the trees, and it wasn't human. It was deep, wet, like something with too many lungs, sucking in air through a mouth that shouldn't exist. Then the smell hit us. Rote, like meat left in the sun for too long. Thick and rancid, coating the air. Ethan turned off the flashlight. "Get in the tent," he whispered. I didn't argue. Inside we sat in the dark, listening. The breathing grew closer, slow, deliberate. The fire outside cast flickering shadows against the tent walls. And for a moment, I saw it. A silhouette, too tall, too thin. Its limbs twisted in the wrong ways. And its head, God, its head was elongated, almost canine, but stretched, wrong. And then, it started to talk. The voice was a whisper, soft, mimicking. It said Ethan's name, then mine, over and over, like it was trying them out, like it was learning. I could hear Ethan's breathing beside me, sharp and shallow. Then the zipper of the tent moved, slowly, deliberately. We couldn't breathe. Then, a low, wet clicking sound from the other side of the fabric. And then, laughter, not real laughter. It was our laughter, imitated, distorted, like it had been listening to us, and was trying to fit in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The breathing, the sounds, the forest came back to life. The crickets, the rustling leaves, like nothing had ever happened. But we didn't sleep that night. We didn't move until dawn. When the sun finally rose, we stepped outside. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anything had ever been there. But Ethan found something near the fire pit, a single long gray tooth, and it was still warm. The first time I saw it, I told myself it was just my imagination. The second time, I knew better. I work as a wildlife researcher, specializing in tracking animal populations in remote forests. It's lonely work, but I love it. The quiet, the endless trees, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. But last winter, I was sent on a research trip to a stretch of unmapped wilderness, deep in the mountains. That's where I learned that some places aren't meant to be explored, because something else lives out there, something that watches. My assignment was simple: spend 3 weeks setting up motion-triggered cameras, collecting data, and mapping signs of local predators. The area was completely untouched. No trails, no campsites, Just an endless sea of frozen pines and silence. My only company was a satellite phone and a small wooden research cabin, built decades ago and left to decay in the cold. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking, placing cameras, and noting fresh animal tracks. But by the fourth day, something changed. I started feeling like I wasn't alone. At first it was just a sensation. The hairs on my neck standing up. The sense that something was just beyond my line of sight. Then I started noticing things. Subtle things. The woods were too quiet. No birds. No rustling branches. Just that heavy, unnatural silence. And then, the first footprints appeared. They were massive, far too big for any animal in the region. Each print had long, clawed toes, and was pressed deep into the snow, like something incredibly heavy had passed through. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was snowmelt distorting the size. Maybe I had misjudged. But the more I found, the less I could explain. Because the tracks didn't just wander aimlessly. They circled my cabin. That night, I locked the doors. The wind howled outside, rattling the old wooden walls, but I barely noticed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I checked my rifle, laid it beside my bed, and then, just as I started to drift off, something scraped against the cabin wall. A long, slow dragging sound, like claws being pulled across the wood. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, listened. Nothing. Then, just as I started convincing myself it was the wind, thump, something hit the cabin, hard, like a massive weight had slammed against the wall. Just outside my bed, I bolted upright, rifle in hand, heart hammering. But there were no footsteps, no movement, just that awful silence. And then, a sound, not an animal, not human, a whisper, right outside the cabin wall. Low, guttural, repeating my name. At first light, I ran outside to check for tracks, and I found them, leading up to my cabin, but none leading away. It had been standing there all night, watching, waiting. I should have left right then, but I was stubborn, logical. I told myself I was just tired. That isolation was playing tricks on me, so I stayed. The next day, I hiked out to check my motion cameras. Every single one had been ripped from the trees, torn apart like paper. Whatever had been watching me, it didn't want to be seen. That night, I barred the doors, boarded the windows, kept my rifle loaded, and my flashlight close, but nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Somewhere around midnight, the scratching started again, slow and deliberate. Then the whispering, but this time, it wasn't just my name. It was my own voice, mocking, repeating things I had said earlier that day. Then, the handle turned. The cabin door shook violently, as something pushed against it. I raised the rifle, heart pounding, ready to fire the second the door gave in. But then, a face pressed against the window. It was twisted, stretched, wrong. A mockery of a human face, too long, too thin, its mouth hanging open too wide, like it had never quite learned how to use it. Its eyes were missing, just hollow, gaping sockets. It pressed both hands against the glass, its fingers bending unnaturally, curling like talons. And then, it smiled. The sound that came out of it was not laughter, not an animal call, not human, something in between, a sound that sent ice through my veins. I pulled the trigger. The window shattered, but when I looked again, it was gone. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I packed my gear, grabbed my rifle, and left everything else behind. The only thing I found on my way back, a pile of bones, stacked neatly in the center of the trail, and on top, one of my missing motion cameras, still intact, still recording. I never watched the footage. I don't want to know what it caught. I should have run the first time I saw it. But I did. I was working the graveyard shift at a gas station off a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a bad gig, just me, a register, and a lot of silence. The kind of place where people only stopped if they were desperate for gas or too tired to keep driving. But there was something wrong with that station, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. It started small, Things would be out of place. The security cameras would glitch at exactly 3:07 a.m. every night. The back storage door would be unlocked, even though I knew I had locked it before my shift started. And then there were the customers. Or rather, the ones that weren't quite customers. One night, around 2 a.m. a man came in. At first he seemed normal, a little pale, a little off, but I'd seen plenty of weird people come through. He was wearing a long dark coat, his hair wet like he had just walked through a storm, except it hadn't rained in weeks. He didn't buy anything, didn't even look around. He just stood at the counter, staring at me. Then, in the softest voice, he asked, "Have you seen it yet?" I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. Seen what? His eyes didn't blink. His skin looked stretched like it didn't quite fit right. "You'll see it soon." Then he turned and walked out. I rushed to the window, watching as he crossed the empty lot. But the moment he stepped past the last gas pump, he was just gone. I tried to convince myself I was just tired. But then, about an hour later, the security monitors glitched again. The screen filled with static, and when it came back, something was standing just outside the station. It wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, with elongated limbs that looked like they had been stretched beyond what was natural. Its skin was pale and slick, and its eyes, I don't even know if I can call them eyes, because there weren't two. There were many, clusters of glowing, pulsing orbs scattered across its face, its arms, its chest. They shifted, focusing on me through the camera. And then it moved. It didn't walk. It twitched. One moment it was at the edge of the lot. The next, it was right outside the glass doors. I backed away, heart slamming in my chest. The store was silent. The hum of the refrigerators suddenly gone. Then, the lights flickered, and I heard it. A whisper, but not one voice. Many, like it was speaking from inside my head. "Let me in." I bolted for the office, locking the door behind me. The security monitors flickered again, the camera feed distorting, and that's when I saw it. The thing was no longer outside. It was inside the store. The footage glitched again, and when it came back, the thing was right in front of the office door. I could hear it, something scraping against the wood. I held my breath, clutching the rusty crowbar I kept under the desk. Then, it stopped, and for a long, awful moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the whisper again, "Not tonight." And just like that, it was gone. The store lights flickered back on. The hum of the refrigerators returned. I checked the cameras. Nothing. But when I finally stepped out of the office, shaking, I found something waiting for me at the counter. A receipt. No purchase. No price. Just a single message scrawled in red ink. "See you soon." I should have listened to my gut. I should have turned around the moment I felt that first prickle of unease on the back of my neck. But I didn't. And now, it won't stop watching me. It started a few nights ago when I was driving home from work. I work late, graveyard shifts, so I'm used to the empty roads, the eerie quiet of the back highways. That night, I took a shortcut, a narrow winding road that cut through miles of dense forest. No streetlights, no houses, just trees on either side, pressing in, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. I'd driven that way before. It was usually uneventful, but this time, I saw something standing in the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as my headlights swept over it, I realized it wasn't. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its limbs were too long, its fingers too sharp, its head slightly tilted, like it was trying to understand me. And its eyes, they weren't right. They reflected the light, like an animal's, but there was something off about them, like they were too deep, too hollow, like they weren't really eyes at all. I slammed the brakes. For a long moment, neither of us moved, and then, it took a step toward me. I don't know why, but I couldn't look away. I should have hit the gas, should have sped out of there, but my hands were frozen on the wheel. The thing took another step, and then, it smiled, or at least, I think it did. Its face stretched, the skin pulling too tight, revealing rows of jagged teeth. That broke the spell. I slammed my foot on the gas, swerving around it, tires kicking up gravel, As I sped down the road, in my rearview mirror, I saw it tilt its head again. And then it started running. I've never driven so fast in my life. I was miles away before I finally let myself breathe. My heart hammered against my ribs, my knuckles white on the wheel. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see it still chasing me. But the road behind me was empty. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had almost convinced myself it was over, that maybe I had imagined it, that maybe it was just a trick of the light, or some wild animal I had mistaken for something worse. Then I saw the footprints, leading from the woods, straight to my front door. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something scraping against the walls, a faint shuffling sound outside my window. But every time I checked, there was nothing there. The next day, I told myself I was being paranoid. But when I stepped outside to go to work, I found something waiting for me. A handprint, smudged against the glass of my car window. But the fingers were too long. I started noticing it everywhere. A dark shape in my neighbor's yard, a figure standing at the edge of the trees when I took out the trash, a reflection in the windows at work, one that disappeared the second I turned around. And always, those two bright eyes, watching me from the shadows. It never came inside, not yet, but I could feel it getting closer. Last night, I made a mistake. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the faint tap, 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 against the glass of my window. And then, I heard my front door creak open. I grabbed my phone, heart pounding, and checked the security camera feed. There was nothing. The front porch was empty. But when I looked at the feed from the back door, I saw it, standing just inside my house. I don't know what to do. I can still hear it now, moving from room to room, dragging its fingernails along the walls. It's waiting, watching, and I think it's smiling. I had spent my entire life hearing stories about the deep woods beyond my grandfather's property. My family owned hundreds of acres of dense Appalachian forest, filled with towering pines, tangled underbrush, and ancient moss-covered stones. My grandfather always warned me to stay away from the farthest part of the land, where the trees grew too close together, and the air felt thick with something unspoken. He never explained why. As a child, I thought it was just an old man's superstition, a ghost story meant to keep me from wandering too far. But when I grew older, I started noticing things, weird things. At night, when the world should have been silent, I would hear something moving in the trees. Not the rustling of small animals, or the distant hoot of an owl. No, this was something else, something big, something that paced just beyond the tree line, always just out of sight. Once, when I was around 14, I stayed outside a little too late. The sun had just set, and the last streaks of orange were fading behind the mountains when I heard it. A low rhythmic tapping. It sounded like bones against wood. Tap, 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 tap. I turned toward the sound, my breath caught in my throat. Something stood among the trees. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and twisted, like tree branches, its skin gray and papery like old bark. It had no face, just a hollow gaping hole where one should have been. The tapping sound came from its fingers, long clawed things that drummed against the trunk of a nearby pine. I ran. I didn't look back. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. But the worst part, in the morning, there were footprints outside my window. I never told anyone, not my grandfather, not my mother. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes, but I never went near those woods again. Until last winter, my grandfather passed away, leaving the land to me. I was 25 by then, and I had convinced myself that the thing I had seen all those years ago had just been childhood fear run wild. I packed my things and moved into the old cabin. The first few weeks were uneventful. Then the tapping started again. It always began just after sunset. I would be sitting in the living room, reading or watching something, when I'd hear it, a soft, deliberate tapping against the trees outside. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I ignored it. But as the days passed, it got louder, closer. One night, I finally decided to confront whatever was making the noise. I grabbed my rifle, threw on my coat, and stepped onto the porch. The woods were silent. No wind, no crickets, just that thick, suffocating quiet. And then, tap, 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 tap. It came from just beyond the tree line. I lifted my rifle and aimed toward the sound. My breath fogged in the freezing air as I squinted into the darkness. And then I saw it, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching me. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. Its skin looked even worse up close, cracked and dry, like old parchment stretched too thin. And its face, that gaping hollow void where its eyes and mouth should have been. I don't remember pulling the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees, sending birds screeching into the sky. But when the smoke cleared, the thing was gone. Only the deep imprints of its feet remained in the snow. I barely slept that night. I locked every door and window, but that did nothing to stop the fear creeping into my bones. Every sound, every creak of the old cabin made my stomach twist. And just past midnight, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the front porch. I froze. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like it wanted me to know it was there. I gripped the rifle with sweaty hands and forced myself to look toward the window. A shadow stretched across the wooden boards. Long fingers, bent, broken things, drummed against the window pane. I took a step back, my heart hammering, my breath caught in my throat, as the thing outside tilted its head toward me. And then, it spoke, not with a voice, not with words, with my own voice. Let me in. The words scraped against my skull, echoing inside my mind like a distant memory. It was using my voice. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping stopped, and then, a fingernail scraped down the glass. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but when the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, the thing was gone. The footprints it had left behind were not normal. They weren't human, and they weren't animal. They were long, hoof-like, but split down the middle, with clawed toes that dug deep into the snow. And there was something else, something that made my stomach turn to ice. Alongside the footprints were other marks, scratch marks, like something had crawled toward my door. On all fours, I packed my bags that day. I left everything behind. I haven't gone back since, but even now, in the dead of night, in the silence of my new apartment, miles away from those woods, sometimes I swear I hear it. Tap, tap, tap. I took the job out of desperation, a security gig at an abandoned mining facility, deep in the mountains, just me, a flashlight, and the endless dark. The money was good, or at least they promised it would be. My life had taken a turn, and I was willing to do anything to make ends meet. So when the ad popped up, promising easy money in exchange for little more than watching security cameras and patrolling a quiet, forgotten site, I jumped at the opportunity. Just watch the cameras, do a few patrols, and make sure no one breaks in, the manager had said. The words echoed in my head as I sat in the cramped, dimly lit control room. It was a simple job, they assured me, a job that would pay well enough to get me back on my feet. What they didn't tell me was that something was already inside. No one had bothered to mention the strange occurrences, the whispers that circled around the place like a lingering shadow. If I had known what I was stepping into, I might have thought twice, but I didn't. And now, here I was, alone in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the dark to keep me company. The first night was uneventful, just the wind howling through rusted pipes, and the distant groan of shifting metal. It was like the place was alive, creaking and whispering in its own forgotten language. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old decaying machinery hung heavy in the silence. I had made my rounds, checking each of the facility's many rooms and hallways, ensuring that nothing had been disturbed. The cameras were all working fine, the monitors flickering occasionally, as static danced across the screen, but nothing out of the ordinary. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I spent hours staring at the monitors, my eyes growing heavy as I tried to stay alert. The only sound was the constant hum of machinery in the distance, the low, monotonous drone that seemed to pulse through the entire building. At times, I thought I could hear something else, a faint whisper, or a creak, but I brushed it off as nothing. I'd never been in an abandoned place before, and the stillness was probably getting to me. By the time my shift was nearing its end, I began to relax, convinced that this was nothing more than a boring job that paid well enough to make it worth the time. I locked the door behind me and prepared to head back to my small makeshift quarters. But just as I was about to step into the hallway, I heard it, a soft rhythmic knocking. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. I'd been alone in this place for hours, after all. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 knocks, spaced perfectly apart, like someone was tapping on a door from the other side. I froze. The knocking echoed through the building, reverberating off the cold concrete walls. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My first instinct was to check the monitors, but when I glanced at the screen, nothing had changed. There was no movement, no sign of anything unusual. The building was empty, just like it should be. But the knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if it was coming from deep within the tunnels that ran beneath the facility. I shook my head, trying to push the unease away. Maybe it was the wind. The place had its creaks and groans, after all. But deep down I knew something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the hall, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The knocking had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. It was as if the building was holding its breath, waiting. I walked through the halls, checking each room, each corridor, but there was nothing, no sign of life, just the cold, lifeless emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. As I walked further into the building, I felt it, a strange pressure in the air. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my breath quickened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around quickly, my flashlight sweeping the darkness, but there was nothing there. I shook my head again, trying to calm myself. This was ridiculous. It was just an old building, nothing more. Yet as I walked back toward the security room, I couldn't help but feel that something was waiting. Something was hiding, just out of sight, watching my every move. I quickly checked the monitors again. The cameras were fine. Nothing had changed, but the unease remained. The next night was no different, except for the fact that I couldn't shake the memory of the knocking. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me like a constant itch I couldn't reach. I tried to focus on my work, but the silence was oppressive. It was almost as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, as I went outside to do a routine check, I noticed something strange. Footprints, large, deep impressions in the dust that covered the ground. They weren't human. They weren't even animal. They were wrong. The tracks led toward the entrance of the mining shaft, disappearing into the shadows. I crouched down, examining them carefully. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, but they didn't make sense. The shape of them was unlike anything I had ever seen before. They didn't belong to any creature I could identify. A sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. My heartbeat quickened, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I stood up and scanned the area with my flashlight. The wind was picking up, howling through the barren trees in the distance, but there was no movement, no sound, just the heavy, suffocating silence of the abandoned facility. I wanted to turn back, but something urged me to follow the trail. Something deep inside me, a voice I couldn't ignore, told me that I had to see it through. The footprints led me deeper into the facility, down into the labyrinth of tunnels that ran beneath the building. The air grew colder as I descended, the walls pressing in on me like they were alive, breathing. The flashlight's beam flickered as I moved, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The knocking was back, but this time it was louder, closer. I followed the sound, the rhythm of it like a heartbeat in the dark. The tunnels twisted and turned, each corner bringing me deeper into the bowels of the facility. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness growing thicker with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, I reached the source of the sound, a door, old, rusted, and barely hanging on its hinges. The knocking was coming from inside, soft at first, then louder, as if whatever was on the other side was trying to break through. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn and run, to leave this cursed place behind and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had been pushed to the edge of sanity, knew that I had to open the door. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. The door creaked as I pulled it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. My flashlight flickered, and then went out, plunging me into darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow. Then I heard it, the soft rasping breath of something in the room. I wasn't alone. A shape shifted in the darkness, moving with an unnatural fluidity. Its form was twisted, distorted, like something that had once been human, but had been corrupted by something ancient, something evil. Its eyes gleamed in the faint light, reflecting a hunger that made my blood run cold. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that glinted in the darkness. It stepped closer, and I could feel the air grow heavier. With each passing second, the weight of its presence pressing in on me from all sides. I had to fight. The flashlight flickered back on, and I swung it at the creature, my hand trembling with fear. The beam of light caught it, momentarily blinding it, and I took the opportunity to back away. But the creature was fast, too fast. It lunged. The creature's claws scraped against the metal walls, sending sparks flying as it crashed into me. I fell to the ground, my body slamming against the cold concrete floor. My heart raced in my chest, and my breath came in short gasps. I scrambled to get back up, but the creature was already on top of me, its foul breath hot against my skin. I reached for anything I could find, my hand landing on a jagged piece of metal. I swung it at the creature, striking it across the face. It let out a shrill, inhuman scream, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it only seemed to grow more enraged. I fought back with everything I had, my instincts taking over. The creature's claws scraped across my arms, leaving deep gashes, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to survive. With one final desperate push, I drove the metal shard deep into the creature's chest. It let out a blood-curdling scream and staggered back, its body twitching violently, before collapsing to the floor in a heap. I stood there, panting, my body covered in sweat and blood. My heart still raced in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, waiting for the next move. When I finally made it back to the surface, the night seemed eerily calm. The wind had died down, and the cold mountain air filled my lungs. But I knew better now. I knew that whatever was in those tunnels had been just the beginning. I left that night, leaving the job behind me, but the memory of what I had encountered stayed with me. And the knocking, it still echoes in my mind. I wonder if it ever stopped. I had always been a fan of the outdoors. Camping trips were a regular part of my life, a way to escape the monotony of everyday existence and find peace in the silence of the forest. So when my friends suggested a weekend getaway to a secluded campsite deep in the woods, I was all in. They promised it would be the perfect retreat, far from the chaos of civilization, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sounds of nature. The drive out there was long, winding through narrow, rugged roads that seemed to go on forever. The further we went, the more the world around us seemed to shift, as if we were leaving everything behind. The dense forest closed in on either side, casting long shadows that stretched across the road, like fingers trying to pull us deeper into its embrace. The air grew cooler as we climbed higher into the mountains, and the sound of the engine was the only thing that broke the deep silence. When we finally arrived, the campsite was just as promised, isolated, peaceful, and serene. There was no one else around, just a few tents scattered along the edge of a small, sparkling creek that wound its way through the valley. The trees were thick with foliage, their branches stretching high into the sky, blocking out much of the sunlight. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional bird call in the distance. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend of fishing, hiking, and storytelling under the stars. The nightfall brought with it an unsettling stillness. The wind died down, and the usual nighttime noises, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, seemed to vanish completely. It was as though the entire forest had fallen into a deep unnatural sleep. As the fire flickered and the night grew darker, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Something about the forest felt off, like there was something hidden in its depths, waiting. The others seemed oblivious, laughing and joking around the campfire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was late when we finally decided to turn in for the night. I lay in my tent, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the silence. But then, in the stillness, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from somewhere just outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. The whispering stopped, and for a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, there it was again, clearer this time. A soft hissing sound, like someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and listened intently. The whispering continued, growing louder, but still too distant for me to make out the words. It was as if it was coming from somewhere deep in the forest, just beyond the reach of the campfire's glow. I wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as the wind, or some animal making noise, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the whispering grew louder, more urgent, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The others were still asleep, oblivious to the strange sounds that had been plaguing me. I scanned the area around the campfire, but there was no sign of anyone, no animals, no movement, just the deep, quiet forest surrounding us, its towering trees standing like silent sentinels in the night. The whispering had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of something in the air, something that didn't belong. I went back to my tent, trying to convince myself that it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, we set out to explore the area, determined to make the most of our time in the wilderness. We hiked along the creek, following its meandering path through the thick undergrowth. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. But the unease from the night before still lingered, like a shadow at the back of my mind. We stopped for lunch near a small clearing, where a cluster of old weathered trees stood in a tight circle. The area felt strangely sacred, as if it had been untouched by time. The air around the trees was thick with the scent of moss and earth, and there was an odd stillness to the place. We sat on a large rock, eating our sandwiches and chatting, but the silence felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. Suddenly, one of my friends, Sarah, stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining to listen. At first I heard nothing but the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But then, faintly, I heard it, a soft rhythmic tapping, like something was tapping against a tree. It was slow at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was the same sound I had heard the night before. We all looked around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but the tapping seemed to come from all directions at once. The trees were too dense to see through, and the forest felt unnervingly still. There was no breeze, no movement, just the eerie tapping sound that seemed to echo in the silence. I suggested we leave, but Sarah seemed hesitant. "It's probably just an animal," she said, though her voice was shaky. "Let's keep going." But the tapping didn't stop. In fact, it only seemed to get louder as we walked deeper into the woods. The rhythmic sound followed us, moving with us, as if the forest itself was alive and keeping pace with our every step. We finally reached the edge of the woods. As the sun began to set, the tapping stopped, and the uneasy feeling that had settled over us seemed to dissipate with the fading light. But as we sat around the campfire that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest had become too quiet, too still, and the trees around our campsite seemed to loom in on us, their branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. That night, the whispering returned. It was louder this time, more distinct, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. I could hear it in the trees, in the wind, in the rustling leaves. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a chorus of voices, murmuring and calling, speaking in a language that sounded ancient and foreign. It was as if the forest itself was alive, and it was trying to communicate with us. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, but the forest was as dark and silent as ever. There was no sign of movement, no animals, no whispers, just the oppressive quiet of the woods. I turned to head back to the campsite when I saw them. Footprints. They were fresh, deep impressions in the dirt, leading away from our camp and into the dense trees. But these weren't animal tracks. They were wrong. They were too deep, too wide, like something far larger than any bear or wolf had left them. And they didn't follow any logical path. They wound in strange, erratic directions, as if the creature had been circling us. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The trees closed in around me, and the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. I knew I shouldn't be out here alone, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was calling to me from deep within the forest, drawing me in like a magnet. The tracks led me to a clearing, where the trees opened up to reveal a strange stone circle. The stones were weathered and ancient, covered in moss and lichen, and they stood in a perfect circle, as though they had been placed there deliberately. The air in the clearing felt heavy, oppressive, as if something was watching me. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the stone circle. It was tall and dark, its features hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there watching me. I ran back to camp, heart pounding in my chest. The others were still asleep, oblivious to the terror that I had just witnessed. I collapsed into my tent, unable to shake the image of the figure in the clearing. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever before. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't escape, and I knew deep down that we weren't meant to leave. The forest had claimed us. The next morning, we packed up and left without saying a word, but the forest followed us. The whispers never stopped, and the shadow of the figure was always in the corner of my mind. We never spoke of what happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The forest would come for us again. They told me it was easy money. Just patrol the perimeter, check the old cabins, and make sure no one squats in the abandoned buildings, the manager had said. What they didn't tell me was that something was already out there. The first night was uneventful, just the wind sighing through the pines, and the distant rustling of unseen animals. But by the second night, I started hearing the howling, low and guttural at first, almost like a coyote, but deeper, too deep. It came in long, drawn-out wails, rising and falling like something was calling out through the trees. I checked the perimeter with my flashlight, my breath curling in the cold night air. The campground was still, the old wooden cabins standing like rotting skeletons against the tree line. But then I saw the footprints. They were massive, larger than any wolf's. The claw marks dug deep into the soil, the stride impossibly long, and worst of all, they walked upright. I should have left right then and there. Any sane person would have. But I told myself it was just a bear, maybe a trick of the light. I convinced myself to stay. That was my first mistake. The third night, I saw it. I was doing my rounds, checking the cabins, when I caught movement near the edge of the trees. A shape tall and hunched, standing on two legs, but moving with an unnatural fluidity. My flashlight flickered as I swung it toward the figure. Eyes large, amber-colored, and gleaming in the darkness. It was watching me. A deep growl rumbled through the trees, vibrating in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs locked in place. The thing took a step forward, its massive frame illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. The creature was covered in thick matted fur, its arms too long, its fingers ending in curved claws. Its snout was elongated like a wolf's, but the intelligence in its glowing eyes was undeniable. It smiled. I don't know how else to describe it. The corners of its mouth pulled back, revealing long, jagged teeth. It was a grin, one that sent ice through my veins. Then it lunged. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, scrambling into one of the cabins and slamming the door behind me. The wood shuddered as the creature hit it, claws raking against the surface. The handle rattled. It was trying to get in. My radio crackled to life on my belt. Static. Then a voice, garbled whispering, impossible to understand, but I swore I heard my name. The doorknob twisted. I shoved a chair under the handle, backing away as the growling grew louder. My flashlight flickered again. The battery's dying. Then silence. For a long time I didn't move. I just stood there in the darkness, listening to my own breathing. The wind howled outside, but the creature was gone, or at least, it wanted me to think it was. I stayed locked inside that cabin until dawn. By morning, I was ready to leave. I didn't care about the job, didn't care about the money. Whatever was in those woods wasn't natural, and I wasn't about to stick around to see what happened next. But when I stepped outside, something was waiting for me. Not the creature, something worse. The trees surrounding the cabin were covered in deep claw marks. But these weren't random. They were deliberate. Symbols, patterns, carved into the bark like warnings. And the footprints, they didn't lead away. They circled the cabin. It had been out there all night, watching. I ran. I didn't stop to check my car. Didn't bother to grab my things. I sprinted down the dirt road, my lungs burning, my heart hammering in my chest. The howling followed me. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. I don't remember reaching my car. Don't remember driving. All I know is that by the time I reached town, my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my phone to call my boss and quit. But the worst part, that night, as I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was over, I heard it again, a low guttural howl, right outside my window. I've always loved hiking. There's something about the silence of the wilderness, the feeling of being miles away from civilization, that clears my mind in ways nothing else can. But after what happened on the Devil's Ridge Trail, I don't think I'll ever step foot in the woods again. I took the trip alone. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a 3-day solo hike through the Appalachian backcountry. I'd done harder trails before, longer treks, and I prided myself on being experienced. This wasn't my first time alone in the woods. I had my gear, my maps, and enough supplies to last a week if needed. The first day was uneventful. Just me, the towering trees, and the endless quiet. The further I hiked, the more I felt that peaceful isolation I always craved. No people, no city noise, just nature. By nightfall, I'd set up camp in a small clearing, near a ridge that overlooked the valley below. I ate my dinner, watched the sun sink behind the mountains, and listened to the distant sounds of owls hooting and insects buzzing. I felt safe, at home. But that changed when the first footprints appeared. I woke up just before dawn, the air crisp and still, as I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My breath caught in my throat. There in the dirt just outside my tent were footprints, not mine. They were large, human-shaped but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch unnaturally high, and the depth suggested something heavy. They circled my tent, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had wandered past in the night, though I knew that was unlikely. I was miles from the nearest trailhead, and I hadn't seen a single soul since I started my hike. I shook off the unease, packed up camp, and kept moving. By midday, I'd reached the highest point of the ridge. The view was breathtaking, rolling green hills stretching as far as the eye could see, bathed in golden sunlight. I sat on a rock, ate my lunch, and tried to forget about the footprints. That's when I saw it. A figure, far in the distance, standing on the next ridge over. It was just a silhouette against the sky, too far to make out any details. But something about the way it stood sent a ripple of unease through me. Perfectly still, watching. I raised my binoculars, heart pounding, But the moment I focused in, it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next empty space. That night, the knocking started. I had set up camp in a narrow valley, surrounded by thick pines. As darkness settled in, the forest grew eerily silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then knock, a single sharp sound echoing through the trees. I froze. It had come from somewhere close. Knock. This time it was behind me. Knock, knock, closer now. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees, my heart hammering against my ribs. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty branches and thick undergrowth. Then I saw them, eyes 2 pinpricks of pale light, staring at me from the tree line, too high off the ground to be an animal. They didn't blink, didn't move. I barely slept that night. By the 3rd day, I just wanted to get out. The forest no longer felt welcoming. It felt wrong. Every time I stopped, I had the overwhelming sense that something was just beyond my sight. Lurking in the trees, I kept catching glimpses of movement, out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting, branches swaying when there was no wind, and the footprints kept appearing. Every time I stopped to rest, there they were, circling, following. By late afternoon, I finally reached the home stretch, a steep descent down the side of the ridge, leading back to the trailhead. I moved fast, practically jogging down the switchbacks, desperate to put the wilderness behind me. Then I heard it, a voice, low, distorted, coming from just ahead on the trail. Help me. I skidded to a stop, my stomach twisted into knots. Help me, it said again. It was close now, just around the bend, but something was off. The voice was hollow, emotionless, like someone was repeating the words without understanding them. I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then I saw it. A figure stepped onto the trail. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were elongated, its skin an unnatural shade of gray. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, God, its eyes were too large, too reflective. It opened its mouth, and the same hollow voice came out. Help me. I ran. I don't remember much of the descent, just the blind panic, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks, branches whipping against my face. The trees blurred together, the world narrowing to nothing but the pounding of my heart, and the sound of something moving behind me. Fast, too fast. By the time I burst out of the woods and into the parking lot, the sun had nearly set. My car was the only one there. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, half expecting to feel cold fingers wrap around my neck. But when I finally looked back, the trail was empty. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. Nothing moved. I drove away and never looked back. Weeks later, I made the mistake of looking up the history of Devil's Ridge. Stories of disappearances, hikers vanishing without a trace, local legends about something that lived in the woods, something that could mimic voices, something that walked the ridge and watched from the trees. And the worst part, a grainy, decades-old photo of the trail. In the background, half hidden among the trees, was a figure, tall, too tall, watching. I took the trip to escape. Life in the city had been suffocating me. Endless noise, blinding lights, and people everywhere, crowding in on me. I needed to get away, to find silence, to breathe again. So I packed my gear, picked a remote mountain trail that few ever hiked, and drove 5 hours into the wilderness. It was perfect. The trail was old, barely maintained, winding through thick forests and skirting the edge of sheer cliffs. No cell service, no signs of civilization, just me and the endless stretch of trees, stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. For the first 2 days, everything went smoothly. I hiked under clear blue skies, camped beside a quiet stream, and fell asleep to the sound of running water and rustling leaves. It felt like I'd stepped into another world, one untouched by time. But by the 3rd day, the fog rolled in. It started as a low mist, curling around my ankles as I walked. I didn't think much of it at first. Morning fog was common in the mountains, burning off once the sun climbed high enough. But this fog didn't burn off. It thickened. By noon I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The world around me had turned into a swirling mass of white, muting all sound except for my own footsteps crunching against the dirt. The trees faded into ghostly outlines, shifting in and out of view as the mist coiled around them. That was when I first felt it. The sensation of being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. Fog had a way of playing tricks on the mind, making the familiar seem strange. But as I kept walking, the feeling only grew stronger. My skin prickled. My breath came quicker. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing just at the edge of the mist. But there was nothing, at least, not that I could see. By evening, I knew I had made a mistake. The fog hadn't lifted all day. If anything, it had gotten worse. My map was useless. I couldn't see any landmarks, couldn't tell if I was still on the trail, or if I had wandered off. Every direction looked the same, a swirling, endless white void. I set up camp in a small clearing, hoping the fog would clear by morning. I built a fire, the flickering flames barely illuminating the space around me. The silence was thick, oppressive. No wind, no insects, no distant hoots of owls or rustling leaves, just stillness. Then, somewhere beyond the mist, a twig snapped. I froze. The sound hadn't been close, but in the unnatural silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. My pulse hammered in my ears as I strained to listen. Then came another sound, a low dragging noise, slow, rhythmic, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. I turned in slow circles, my flashlight cutting through the fog, but all I saw was the swirling mist. And then, just for a second, I saw something, a shape, tall, unnaturally thin, moving in the distance, its form shifting as if the fog itself was part of it. It wasn't walking, it was gliding. I barely slept that night. By morning the fog was still there. I packed up and started walking, heart pounding with every step. I needed to find the trail. I needed to get out of there. But the fog was disorienting, swallowing up everything around me. The trees looked unfamiliar, twisted into strange shapes by the mist. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine. They were large, deep imprints in the damp earth. But what made my blood turn to ice was the spacing. They were too far apart. Whoever, or whatever, had made them, had a stride twice the length of a normal person's. And worse, they weren't leading away. They were circling, around my campsite, around where I had slept. Something had been watching me all night. I started moving faster, practically jogging through the thick mist, desperate to find my way back to the main trail. But no matter how far I walked, nothing looked familiar. It was like the fog had swallowed the world, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Then I heard the breathing, slow, deep, right behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip. The mist parted just enough to reveal something standing a few feet away, tall, towering over me. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, veins pulsing beneath the surface. Its limbs were long, too long, fingers ending in claw-like points. But its face, it didn't have a face, just a smooth expanse of flesh where eyes, a nose and a mouth should have been. Then it moved, not walking, gliding toward me, silent despite its massive size. I ran. I don't know how long I sprinted through that fog, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. All I knew was that the thing was behind me, closing the distance without a sound. I could feel it. I could hear the whisper of its movements, the slow, unnatural shift of its body through the mist. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog began to thin. The trees became clearer. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. And when I risked a glance over my shoulder, it was gone. I don't remember getting back to my car. One moment I was lost in that endless white void. The next I was stumbling into the trailhead parking lot, gasping for breath. The fog still clung to the treetops, but the path ahead of me was clear. I drove away without looking back. That was a year ago. I haven't gone hiking since. I haven't even left the city. But sometimes on cold, misty mornings, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I feel it again, watching, waiting,